It's my pleasure today to introduce Gino Ricciardelli. Gino Ricciardelli is a long time engineer and is a real pioneer in the Binghamton market and other places too. Rick, thanks so much for coming over and sharing your thoughts with me. I think it's terrific.
I'm very
you
happy
should do
to
that.
be here, and I've got a whole mess of pictures and,
Okay.
and information that everybody would be interested in.
Let's start off by having you tell us about your background, your early biographical stuff.
Okay. Instead of being drafted during World War II, I enlisted in the Signal Corps because that was one way of staying out of the infantry.
Okay, before that, are you from Binghamton?
No. I came from a little town called West New York, New Jersey, which is right across the river from 42nd Street.
Oh.
And I came to Binghamton mainly to get an education. Cornell University was running a nighttime school at one of the high schools, North High, and I attended that for 9 months.
Huh.
And but previous to that, before I got drafted, not drafted, before I enlisted, I went to a school in the Bronx, took up electronics and another free. These are all free because I didn't have any money to go to college.
How old were you at that time?
I was 19, 20.
So you graduated from high school then?
Yeah, and I went into these other schools to pick up electronics. So I went to a school in Bronx for 9 months. I went to school here in Binghamton. I came up here in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor occurred. And
that was what, Triple Cities College?
No, that was at a high school. It was under the auspices of the government. The government at that time was conducting all these schools at high schools to train people because we were going into the war. We needed people, and so that gave me an opportunity to get an education because my family didn't have money to send me to college. But I did get to go to one for another 9 months. So I entered the Army as an enlisted reserve, but before I went to active duty, they sent me to a college called Drexel Institute in Philadelphia. It was the MIT of its day.
Right.
It had an elaborate laboratory and they sent me there for 9 months. And after that, they put me into active duty. I went to Fort Dix and went through the routines that you do when you get basic training. And after the basic training, they sent me and 12 other people to New York City to attend a course on what we call submarine cable. What a submarine cable was, the cable that went between New York and London into the ocean, and that was called submarine cable. And we went to this Western Union, a place where they trained us in that particular phase. So we went there for 9 months or so, and then they sent us overseas. We landed in North Africa. We landed in what was Morocco, and then into Algiers. And we then proceeded to build the cable equipment to go on both ends of the cable. We built that in a French school. They put us up in this French school that had a little shop, and we were able to, and we took the diagram that the engineers from Western Union gave me. In fact, I have a copy of it home yet.
Oh.
And from that diagram, we built 4 units. And the idea was that when we were going to invade the southern part of France to drive the Germans back, that we could use the cables there were 6 cables going between North Africa and France, because Algeria was a colony of France at the time. And I went every week up and down the coast between Algeria and Tunisia, and I checked the cables to see that the Germans hadn't cut it, because they could cut it by taking a ship, drag an anchor, and break the cable.
So these cables were underwater then?
Yeah.
And so you were on ship going up and down?
No, I was
No?
I was on land. I had a driver who drove me back and forth in a Jeep. We went back and forth.
Well, so were the cables on shore, or how did you get to?
Oh yeah, the cables ended up in what we call a cable house. There was a little shack,
Uh-huh.
and I would put my equipment on it, and I had all the information that the British gave me to tell me that the cable was good or bad. Okay,
Uh-huh.
I had a piece of equipment that did this, and ironically, they invaded. The idea of the submarine cable was the Germans couldn't intercept the messages. The only way they couldn't go tap on the cable, because the minute you touch the cable, you'd know about it. I mean, the thing would cease. So the theory was they could send messages without the Germans, because the Germans were decoding messages off the air. I mean, transmitters and what have you. So they went to southern France, and they went so fast. They made the Germans move so fast, there was no need for this communications anymore, okay? So the equipment just sat there, and all that information that I had for the cable. Well, just before the invasion, I did go up and down, and the Germans did cut the cables. And English colonel, who I reported to, said, well, that's easy, we'll get a cable ship down here, and we'll splice the cable. So I said, there's only one cable ship in the world, and it's sitting in London. And by the time that comes from London to where we are, we're not going to need it. So he quit that. So the next thing I did was I was sent into Italy. I went into Italy, and I brought the equipment with me on the idea, I don't know whether we were going to use it or not, because I couldn't conceive of any other use for it. They were on mainland. And so we sat around. 12, we had a unit. We were a unit all by ourselves, 12 men. 8 of them were teletype operators, and the other 4 were technicians, myself and 3 other guys. And we waited and waited to see what was going on. Then one day I was told I was going to go into the island of Malta. The island of Malta was an island off of Sicily, because there was a cable between Malta and Tunisia, and the British Navy wanted to use that. And so up until that point, the only way you could transmit over the cable was a keying, Morse code, and you read a tape, and it had little things in it, and somebody could read it. And it was about 25 words per minute. Well, with my equipment, I could then hook it up to a teletype machine, and I could get 60 words per minute. And the British were enthralled with this. So they sent me to Island of Malta, myself and one of my engineers went with me, and we set up the equipment between Tunisia and Malta. And I was there for about 6 or 8 months. My technician went back to Italy. I was left there to make sure the stuff was going to work. I worked with 4 women. They were called Wrens, Women's Royal English Navy. They were equivalent to our WACs and what have you. And they did all the teletyping.
Now, when was this? This was during the war.
Yeah.
What year was it?
Well, it was 1945.
Okay.
During that time, 40, well, end of 44 and 45. In that.
And what was your rank? Your rank?
Oh, I was a tech sergeant.
Tech sergeant?
All my people were tech sergeants. That's how they set it up. So after that, I left Malta, put me back to Italy, and by the time I got back to Italy, the war in Europe had ended. And so the next project was, what do we do with these 12 guys, okay? So they suddenly came up with the idea, we had what we call walkie-talkies. They were the cell phone of its day. They were about this big and this high. And suddenly we were told we were going to repackage these and send them to the Japanese war, which was still going on, okay? So I went into a plant that made wine bottles, and it had a conveyor belt. That was the thing that I decided that's what we needed, because we're going to package these up in metal and wooden boxes and then ship them out. So the trucks kept bringing in truckloads of these walkie-talkies. Actually, they were dump trucks. They dump them right on the ground, you know, pile them. And so the next question was, we had to check them out. We had to change the frequencies because we were going into a new theater of war. And so there were just 4 of us, technicians. And I said to the colonel, or whatever his rank was, we can't handle all this stuff. We'll never, you know, by the time we do this, who knows what. So they said, okay, we're going to fix this. So I said, how are you going to fix it? So one day, 30 German prisoners of war, after the war was over, showed up at my place. There's a sergeant, and I talked to the sergeant, because you'd be a sergeant in the German army, you have to know Russian, French, Italian, and English, okay? So I could converse with them. So I said to him, how am I going to train your people to do this when I don't speak German? So he said, that's easy. They already know about your equipment. They've been dealing with it for years. So don't worry about it. They can do it. And they did. They did it, and I went out and hired 50 Italians from the local city, and they were the packagers. They packaged it up, they put it in the, and then we had to have a couple of guards to keep the Italians and the Germans from, the Italians were going to beat them up because the war was over, they were going to get even again, okay? So we had to have guards to prevent this. So we did this for about 6 months, and then the atomic bomb was dropped. The war ended in Japan. There was no need to ship this equipment. And that was the end of my time in the Army. After that, I came home.
Great.
So that was how I operated in the Army. And that's how I got all this training. I got the electronics training in the schools that I went to, and Drexel. That was my electronic background, because when they got me into submarine cable, I was very disappointed, because I wanted to work with transmitters and things, and this was what we call DC. It was direct current stuff. It wasn't very high technology. It'd been around for 100 years before I got to it. So, and you know, I was discharged and came home. And after I came home, I sat around for about a month, and I got tired of sitting around doing nothing. So I found an ad in one of the magazines, because before I went into the Army, I worked at WNBF as a switchboard operator. I plugged in phones on the weekends.
Is this, how old were you at that time?
I was 19.
19.
You know, just starting out. I just got to Binghamton. In fact, I came to Binghamton, believe it or not, with $50 in my pocket.
Oh.
Okay, and I happened to, was lucky enough to get with this guy who convinced me to come up here. I lived with his family, so you know, some of my expenses weren't too great. And then, in order to supplement that, believe it or not, I got a job at McLean's department store. And at McLean's department store, I worked in the women's dress department, and all I did was wrap up the dresses when they were sold, put them in the box, and hand them to the customer. And I did that for about 6 months or so, and then I went into the Army. So that's my background as far as the Army is concerned.
Yeah.
Now, after I got out of the Army, I got myself a job as a transmitter operator. That's what they were called in those days, at a station in Schenectady, New York. It was a 250-watt AM station. It was owned by 2 guys who had the Procter & Gamble advertising client. And that was where they made their money. The station was something they just dabbled in. And
What were the call letters?
WSNY. And it was, I was there for about another 6 months because I wanted to come back to Binghamton. And I got to know the chief engineer His name was Lou Stantz, and I kept coming back, seeing if they had an opening. Well, you know, it took me a few weeks, and I came back every weekend to make sure if there was an opening, I was going to get there. And one day, one of the guys quit. The transmitter operator quit, and Lou Stantz called me and hired me, and that's how I got involved with WNBF.
Now, at that time, your transmitter had to have an operator on duty
All the time.
24 hours,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And so you came back as a radio engineer?
I was a radio operator.
Right.
I became a radio engineer after I was at the station for a while, since I had the background. And the other there were four other operators, you know, going around with the shifts. They didn't want to have anything to do with maintenance. They didn't want to maintain anything. All they wanted to do was operate, which was pretty simple in those days. Operate meant if the transmitter was working, you had to take readings every half an hour.
Yeah.
You had to have a log, and the log had the FCC required this. And so that's what you did. Every half an hour you went around to
No, this was radio at this
radio.
time.
Yeah, this
Okay.
was radio. And when I got there, we were on they were on FM. They went on FM during the war, the latter part of the war, on a 44 megahertz band. It wasn't on the same band that we are now. It was a lower frequency. And finally, the commission said, we're going to move you all up into this high band, which is where we are today, and we're giving this band to the sheriff's departments of the country to use for communications, because in those days, automobiles could only take a low frequency. They weren't ready for any high frequency stuff like we have today. So we operated, I'm trying to get the picture here, if I get it here in a minute. Yeah, this is it. There's a low band, those two cabinets off to the right there are the two cabinets for the low band FM. And we operated on the low band FM and we operated on the high band FM simultaneously until such time as the station thought that people would have enough equipment to get the high band.
Now, where was this?
This is on Ingram Hill Road. You mean where was it located?
Okay.
Yeah, we're at Ingram Road. Yeah, these are the towers of the AM, 3-tower AM array. You only see, yeah, you can see the third one.
Are those
there.
towers still there?
Oh yeah, they're still
So,
there.
and these towers were put up, you say, in the 40s?
Yeah, they were put up near the end of the war. Because previous to that, WNBF went on the air in 1928 on a transmitter on Mill Street off of the south side. There was a tragic thing happened. One of the engineers electrocuted himself up there.
Do you recall his name?
I have it home somewhere and I forgot to dig it out. But anyway,
How much power was there?
Oh, I think it was about 100 watts. It wasn't very big.
But that's a lot of electricity, isn't it?
Oh, well, yeah, he was trying to fix something, apparently. Anyway, they then moved from Mill Street to West End Avenue between Johnson City and Binghamton. The idea was it was on the borderline, you could cover both cities, okay? That was the idea of putting it there. And it was there for quite a period of time until at the end of the war, they went to this 3-towered array on Ingram Hill, and they went from 1490 was their frequency when they were on West End at 250 watts, and then they went to 5 kilowatts at the top of Ingram Hill. That was the big expansion.
At 1490?
No,
or is
they
that when
went
they moved?
1290. That was when they went to 1290. Okay? So that's the early part of WNBF radio. Then when we went to the high band FM, we put in a 10 kilowatt, which you'll see here. Right there it is. You can, that's the consoles operate both the AM and FM
And
at the transmitter site. This is all at the transmitter site.
so the radio with the console there. So the announcers were there, or was that just for the transmitter?
No, just the transmitter. No, they're always. All the people were down in the Arlington Hotel. We never had anybody at the transmitter doing anything. And that was my first project as a maintenance. I was then maintenance engineer. I was given that terminology. I put that 10 kilowatt together.
Wow.
And put that on the air. And when I finished that, then we dropped the 44 megahertz, the old band. We took that off the air. And people could buy for $10 if you had a radio that had inputs to put audio into. Some of the radios had inputs. You could buy this thing for $10. It was the converter. So you could convert the FM into your AM radio.
Oh.
So a lot of people went out and bought these things, and we started to get some sort of an audience. And then in order to prove to people that this is high fidelity, okay, we played classical music. We didn't play anything but classical music. Every time was, that's what we continually played. And we were on the air for about 6 or 7 hours a day. I think we came on at 5 o'clock and went off at
Just
11.
in the evening then?
Yeah, we just operated in the evening. Then eventually we started operating during the day. But then what happened was FM couldn't make any money. So the station took it off the air. WNBF FM went off the air and came back in 1956 when it was now saleable. You could sell commercials, you could make some money. So then they came back in 1956. Now, just to give you the history of the stations as they occurred, of course, WNBF, as I said, was 1928. WRNR was the next station on the air in the market. It came on in 1946.
Were you involved in that?
No, I got involved later, but not then.
Okay.
Then KOP came on the air in 1947, in June of that year, and E&E came on the same year in September. E&E came on with a 5-tower array. I think it's still up there on the hill, on Pierce Hill. And then EBO came on in Owego, and that was in 1957. And then in 1966, I put a 10-watt FM station in the college.
In 1957, you said?
1966.
Uh-huh.
That's when that WHMRW, that was the call letters. And it's still there.
Right.
But it was just...
Are they still 10 watts?
No, they're about a kilowatt or something.
Oh, okay.
No, the budget was so small that I eventually bought a used one from a college in Connecticut and then put that on the air. And the antenna, Charlie Hallinan, who was the chief engineer at KOP, he had an antenna that he took down, he replaced with another one, and he donated this antenna, and we put it on a wooden pole. And because previous to that, I installed what we call a common carrier system on AM. I forget the frequency, and it went over the electric power lines, and you could plug into the power line, and you could,
It was on campus, right?
Yeah, it was on campus. But this is when they only had 2 dorms. But when they expanded the dorms, that didn't work very well, so we went to the FM thing. So that's how the AM WHRW was not an AM, it was FM.
And they went on the air as an FM then?
Yeah, they were on.
They were at 88 point or something?
Yeah, 88.1.
Somewhere in there, yeah.
Now the FMs, WNBF on the high band went on the air in 1947. And then they went dark. They went off the air in 1951. They came back in 1956. WKOP FM went on the air in 1954. WMRV FM, which was then E&E, I guess the callers, they went on in 1969. And I think the WMRV, if I'm correct, I think Merv Griffiths owned that station.
Yeah.
I think so.
But I thought that MRV went on the air a lot later. I thought they went on in the 60s.
Yeah, 1969.
Oh, okay. I thought you said 59.
No, 59.
Okay.
And then we had the FM frequency that was in Owego was moved to Binghamton and is now known as WLBT. That was 1972. WSKG FM came on in 1975. And then they have another one, WSQX, and I don't know when that came on the air because I couldn't find any information. That's the second station.
Yeah, that's the one that went on, that was a jazz station that went on the air, around 1980 or somewhere?
Probably.
Yeah.
And then we had another station come on the air in 1989 called WKGB.
Uh-huh.
And the KGB was the Russian,
The CIA.
okay?
Yeah.
Then in 1995, we have another station coming on called WCDW. It's a low-power FM, which has a bunch of translators to get around with. And then they came on with a station, WRRQ, in 2009, and that's the total of the FM stations in this market. So everything, gradually grew and grew. When you think about it, during the period of 1928 till NBF put a station, full-blown station, people used to put up long wire antennas in their backyard. Take a long piece of wire and run it, and they could get maybe some New York stations if the weather was right, or they'd get WHAM out of Rochester, which was another high-power station. So that's what people had. They had no choice. All they had was one station until these other stations came on the air. So that's effectively the story of the history.
What? Oh, okay. Did you had something else?
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you about some of the people you worked with, some of the management people.
Yeah.
Do you recall those people?
Well, my boss was Lou Stantz. Previous to Lou Stantz, there was a chief engineer called Lester Gilbert. He went and put stations on the air in South Korea for some reason. I don't know why, but he did. And then Lou Stantz became the chief engineer. And the manager's name was Cecil Maston. He was the manager during the period that I was at the station. And to give you a little story about Mr. Maston, he was a very outgoing, and he conducted meetings. He didn't care if he used swear words or whatever. When he had a meeting, he had a meeting. And then so one day, I got called into his office, which is rare. I didn't get called into the manager's office. But the chief engineer said, "We got to go into the manager's office today because we want to discuss something." So I thought, well, it must be another big project. Maybe we're going to do something else, So the manager pointed at me and said, "How would you like to be a chief engineer?" So I looked at my boss and said to myself, "Are they going to get rid of him?" And so this manager guy was very astute. He could read my eyeballs and know what I was thinking. And he said, no, we're not getting rid of Lou Stantz. But there's an opening at a station that the Scranton Times in Scranton is going to put on the air at Channel 16. And they require a chief engineer because they had a CP, but they had nothing going. So I sat there and I thought about it for a while, and then the manager said, you didn't realize it. You went down to give a talk to an association of servicemen, TV service people, because in those days there were no UHF channels on in Scranton yet, and people were picking up Channel 12. You could see Channel 12 antennas all over Scranton. And I came down to give a talk on color television and he said, "That was your interview." I said, "That was my interview?" Yep. The manager was sitting in the audience, and he thought you did a fine presentation, and we convinced him that you had the background to do it. Now he said, "Do you really want to do it?" So I sat there and I said, "Well, I got to talk it over with." At that time I was going with my wife. I wasn't married yet, but I was going with her, and she worked at the station. Her name was Shirley Sweet in those days. She was the chief copywriter for the radio and for the television, and she went to work at the station in 1941. She did the same thing I did. She ran a switchboard for a little while, and then she finally got a job in the copy department, and then the chief copy person left, and they made her the chief copy, and she had herself and two girls. They wrote all the radio, television commercials, and she did that until 1946. No, I'm sorry. She did that for 1952. And so I took her out to dinner, and I said, "I got this opportunity. What do you think I ought to do about it?" Because we were thinking of getting married. I mean, we were engaged. By the way, we got engaged on Valentine's Day.
Oh,
okay. And so she said, "It's an opportunity to do it." I said, "Yeah," but I said, "You know, you're going to have to give up what you're doing, and you like what you're doing." I said, "I don't want to put you in that position." She says, "Don't worry about it. We'll see what happens." So I said, "I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'll go down there, I'll take the job, and I'll see if it's for real." I said, "Well, I'm going to like it or not going to like it before you quit and make a move to come down to Scranton." So I was there for about 6 months, and it looked like these people were going to go on the air. In fact, they already had the cameras, the audio equipment that General Electric had shipped under a contract during the freeze. There was a freeze on, if you remember. You couldn't get any channels for about 2 or 3 years. And so they had all this equipment. All it was in boxes and storage and all that. And so it looked like to me, and we also had an order for the second UHF transmitter that was going to come out of General Electric in Syracuse. And so that was a sure sign, because it was tough to get a transmitter, because everybody wanted to get on the air. There were hundreds and hundreds of stations trying to get on the air. So I told her, "I think it's a deal." And then in July of that year, we got married. Okay, and 6 months later, the Scranton Times decided they didn't want to get into the television business. Okay, they decided that the only network they could get was ABC, and they only had 1 hour a week of programming, and syndicated shows weren't that. So the owner and the manager of the paper and the manager of the station called me in the office and said, we're not going into television, but we want you to stay on," because they had a radio station. You know, they had a radio station. It was a kilowatt on 630 kilocycles, and it covered quite a large area. And the tower was on the top of the building that the newspaper was, and it's still there. In fact, you and I are going to go down there maybe this spring, and we're going to see that situation.
Maybe I should point out, Will Rickenberg is on camera here.
Yeah.
Just point that out.
Yeah. So I then decided, well, I got to do something. Well, there was no opening. You know, my wife was talking about getting me back to NBF, but there was no opening. So I finally, through the auspices of RCA, who was a salesman, a very good friend of mine, he got me to go to Reading, Pennsylvania, where there was a UHF station on channel 61.
What was the RCA representative's name?
You got me at the moment.
Okay, so you went to Reading then.
I went to Reading, and I took with me one of the engineers that was working at WNBF, we got pretty friendly over the period of time, and he wanted to make a move. So I said, you can come with me, be my assistant, and because what was happening was the engineers that they had there couldn't get the station up to full power. They were having all sorts of problems. They weren't getting anywhere. So they decided this guy has to go. And so they hired me. And I was there for 6 months, and I worked with General Electric very closely, and we got the transmitter up to full power. But we had one problem. The manager, the owner, decided to put the transmitter in such a position, a location, that he thought he could cover Philadelphia, Scranton, you name it. Well, the transmitter, believe it or not, was 26 miles from the studio. Okay, when you were at the studio and something happened to the transmitter, you get in your car, you're 26 miles to get to the transmitter. And so eventually, his wife's money is what he was using, and she divorces him.
Oh, jeez.
Okay? And the station went dark, and I knew it was going to happen, so I got out before it got dark. Okay? And then an opening did occur. Meanwhile, my wife was still working at WNBF while I was doing all this running around, because I didn't want her to make any moves from her job that she loved to do. So an opening occurred for what we call the project engineer. Okay? What that job was, we would revamp present television equipment, that we upgraded it to do things more than it did when it came from the manufacturer. I had a young guy, his name was Peterson. He came from Rensselaer Institute in Albany, and he was he's a top-notch guy. He just graduated, but he had a lot of background. So between the two of us, we actually manufactured equipment. He came up with the first design of what we used to call a distribution amplifier. This was an amplifier that every time you wanted to feed a monitor, you'd have to have an amplifier for every monitor. He came up with an amplifier that you could feed 6 monitors without having all that equipment. And so that was a plus. Then he and I developed the first test equipment to test the system. We had what we call stair steps and all sorts of technical names for what we were doing. And we developed the only problem was it was all tube type. And tube type wasn't very stable. It would work one day, another day it wouldn't work. You go back in, you make some adjustments. We didn't have transistors yet, so it worked for a while, but then it disappeared. Meanwhile, some company in New York made one that worked. We didn't get any credit for it.
So you didn't patent it?
No, we didn't patent it, no. In fact, it belonged to the company, to the station that belonged to us. So we did that, and we built equipment. And we did this in a building called the Knickerbocker Building, which is where Riverwalk Hotel is. It was on the corner there. It was a roller skating rink up on the 3rd floor. Huh. And we turned the roller skating rink into a studio. And then on the 1st floor, the engineer and I had our shop. And we had another guy who was a carpenter. He built sets those days. We had a pretty good staff that did a lot of this, because we're the only station on the air, and the money was rolling in. Right. It was just coming in. The salesman didn't even have to go out and meet the clients. He'd do everything on a telephone. So I was there for 2 years, and finally they fired my boss, Lou Stantz. He got involved in some things other than engineering, and he got canned. So everybody thought I was going to get the position, but I didn't, because of some company politics going on. Guy from the transmitter was working for me when I was there. He gets the job. He gets to the manager. What his name was? You might remember the manager at MBF.
George Dunham?
George Dunham.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, George Dunham made him the chief engineer. So when that happened, I said to my wife, Cheryl, I don't want to just be here doing this kind of work. I want to become a chief engineer again. So she said, okay, how are you going to do that? So I said, well, I'm going to put my hands in a headhunter, a guy who finds openings. It's going to cost me some money, but that's the route to go.
Oh.
So this guy who ran this company that found places for announcers, people in the business.
The headhunter.
A headhunter, that's the guy. He gets me a job at a station in Palm Beach, Florida.
Oh.
Okay? And when Cheryl heard this, she went out of her mind. Oh, we're going to go south. We're going to have to put up with the winter and everything else.
Okay.
I said, yeah, but you're going to have to quit what you're doing here. So when I got to the station, I discovered they needed a copywriter because the one that was there was leaving, and
Right.
she wasn't too great, and the manager wasn't happy with her.
Oh.
So I said to Cheryl, I was there 6 months myself, and then July I said to her, I got a job for you. When I come down, and I said, this place looks like it's a going thing.
Uh-huh.
So she comes down, she becomes the copywriter. She writes copy, she goes out. She not only writes copy, she produced shows, and we had all sorts of people down there in Florida who were either in the show business or they were retired and they're still diddling around, and the manager knew them and he'd bring them on. We had a show in the middle of the day, some comedian guy that was on Broadway or something, he was retired, and he'd come in and do a show or talk show or something. But anyway, after being there 6 months, we both decided that Florida wasn't our cup of tea. We liked the Four Seasons.
Yeah.
And besides that, anytime you hired anybody in Florida in those days, all you could hire them for was minimum wage. You couldn't hire anybody. I don't care what talent they had. Minimum wage, that was the thing. Because we used to joke, we used to say they pay you in sunshine when you're down there in Florida. So suddenly the press decided to buy WINR radio and the CP that went with it from Mayor Kramer. He was mayor of the city at the time. And when they did that, I had a very close relationship with a man by the name of Green, Ben Green, who owned Federal Electronics, a parts store down there on the highway.
Uh-huh.
And he heard about it, and he had some contact with the publisher, who was Fred Stein, and he said, I got just the guy to put your station on the air. So I get a call one night saying, how would you like to come back to Binghamton?
This when you were in Florida?
Yeah, how would you like to come back to Binghamton? So, and my wife was standing by with the phone, and I said to her, we can go back to Binghamton if you want. Oh, she said, let's go. Let's go. So that's how I got back.
And when was that?
1957.
57.
Believe it or not, my first day was April Fool's Day, April 1st. And so I came back to Binghamton, and I put WINR on the air. We went on the air in November of 1957. Because I came on in April, and we got the equipment together rather fast, because I had some good contacts with the RCA people. Because in those days, all you could buy was RCA or General Electric. They didn't have all these little companies that we now have. And so I got the equipment, the transmitter and everything, and we put it on in what we call Windy Hill, where INR's tower was off the highway beyond the mental hospital there, State Hospital. It's on a hill up there.
That was off Robinson Street?
Yeah. And before we did this, I said to the publisher he was in charge of seeing the station right, but he knew nothing about television. He knew the newspaper business, but and so I said to him, you shouldn't go on that hill, because now everybody's going to have an antenna pointing one direction, and then an antenna pointed towards Ingram Hill. And I said, that's not going to work. You're not going to get a good audience. You ought to move and put the station on in Ingram Hill. So he said, well, we can't do that, because if we do that, we'd have to have 4 guys at the INR site, then we'd have to have 4 more people at the Ingram Hill site, and we double our payroll, okay? So I said, no, we can't do that. We can't sell that to the home office. So we went on the air there, and when we went on the air, we discovered, I already knew what was going to happen, but we discovered we had holes in our coverage. So we had to put translators on the air. We had to put a translator on in Shenango Bridge. We put a translator on in Johnson City. We put a translator in Endicott, and we ran these translators to cover the. But the problem with the translators were the technology wasn't very great, and they'd be off the air more than they were on the air. And we'd spend days going around fixing these things all the time. So eventually, press sold the station to a company called Stainless Tower. They made towers. They manufactured towers, and how this happened was I got to know the president of the tower company because I was involved in towers. In fact, the tower at Reading was the first 1,000-foot tower in this country that Stainless built. And I got to know the president, and he loved engineers. He loved engineers. He hated announcers, he hated production people, but he liked engineers. It's not that he just didn't get with him. He wasn't his thing.
Well, he was a tower guy.
Yeah, he was a chemical engineer to start with.
Oh.
And his brother started the business, and his brother passed away, and he became the president of the company. So I called him up one day, and I said, "Do you want to buy a television station?" Because he kept asking me, "I'd like to buy a television station." I said, "You got one right here." I said, big and press one. So they got together, and he bought it. And when he bought it, we put a tower up for on Ingram Hill. I convinced him to put a tower up on Ingram Hill for SKG, because SKG had to have. That's where they were going to go. Because I was there.
Southern Tier Educational Television.
Yeah, I was their consultant for 2 years.
Oh.
So I got him to put the tower up, and we put a tower up that could take 3 antennas. We called it a candelabra, just like that piano player. And we put SKG on the air, and then when he bought the station, of course, we took and moved over to Ingram Hill. We bought another new transmitter and everything, and we put it up on Ingram Hill. And then the other theory was we were going to get the Channel 34 to go on the tower. So, and the reason for doing this, obviously, was financial. We were going to get rentals. Well, the publisher, the newspaper, before I moved over, because we were still on Windy Hill, and SKG was on the air, and I went to him and told him, we can go on that tower, and all the antennas will be pointed in the same direction. So he said, "Who's on the tower?" I said, "WSKG." "Not going to go on. Have nothing to do with educators. I don't want. I think that whole SKG is a joke." That's what he told me. We were sitting in his office.
Now this is Fred Stein.
Yeah. And I'm sitting there. I'm a consultant. He knows about it, but he told me one thing when I became a consultant. You can't interfere with your job. If I hear you're interfering with your job, you're out of here. So I said, I won't interfere with my job. I'm going to do this right.
So let me just backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
So you helped SKG go on the air?
Oh, yeah.
Were you involved in putting the transmitter in?
No, I didn't. I had
But
guys,
you were a consultant.
guys did it.
Right.
I found the site. I got the tower. I bought the transmitters. I bought the cameras and all that stuff. But we had an engineer and 2 other guys who did all the work. I didn't do it because I couldn't. I was still working for Fred Stein, and he'd catch me up there working on that equipment at the end of the world. So we moved up and got on the tower after the station was sold, so we didn't have to deal with Fred Stein anymore. But then we went over to 34, and they didn't want to go on the tower. They didn't want to pay the rental.
Was it expensive?
Oh yeah, $45,000 a year.
Oh.
And so they put up their own 500-foot tower, which is what they got now. then SKG didn't make payments on the rental. Went about 6 months, no payment. So I get a call from my friend from Stainless, name was Henry Gazewitz, says to me, go up there, put a padlock on their door, because I'm going to get a lien against that station because they haven't paid the power. So I said, hold it, don't do that. So he said, why not? I said, because you'll get a bad name in the community. The community are going to hate your guts. I said, let's see if we can work out something. So he said, okay, let me think about it. So he comes back one day and says to me, I got a solution. I'm going over there, and I'm going to, they had just gotten 2 Ampex tape machines. The state funds, okay? So they had 2 of them. And they didn't really need 2 of them. But this guy who was in charge then, Jerry Brown, you remember that name? And then your friend, what's that?
Oh, Phil Jackson.
Yeah, came in and saved the station.
He sort of bailed him out.
Yeah, he bailed it out. So he worked out a deal. You give me a tape machine and I'll forget the rental. But you got to start paying from then on. So that's how we got a tape machine, a video tape machine. And so when that was all well and done with, we decided.
Just a moment.
Yeah.
Is it true? Now, you talked about the candelabra.
Yeah.
Is it true that there are 3 of them up there?
Right now there is, yeah.
There are 3 of them, right?
Yeah.
Is it true that one of them is a clay pipe?
Yeah. Both of them were cylinder, what we call pylon antennas. The digital that I put up there is not a pylon. It's an array of various things sticking out off the tower.
But for a long time, then there were 3 of them up there, and one of them.
No, there were 2 for a long time, right. And this other part of the candelabra had what we call a dummy pole,
right,
to balance the.
Right. Okay, so it wasn't the sewer pipe then?
No, it wasn't a sewer pipe.
Yeah, okay.
So then when we went to digital, of course, well, first of all, SKG got off the tower because they didn't want to pay our rental. When a guy by the name of Ichikawa put a tower up across the street from us, and he managed to get them to go on his tower, which is where they are now. So we lost that revenue, and but we left the antenna up there because if you took the antenna down, then you'd have to put another piece of pipe up there to balance it off. So the theory was that's going to cost $30,000 to $50,000. Take that antenna down, put another one up. So we left it there. That was the deal we made with them. So it's still there. Both the Channel 40 antenna and their antenna, they're alike because they came from RCA, and I was the one that got the antennas up there. So they're still there, and we're just going to leave them there until they rust or fall off or something. And
so right now there's one antenna up there, right?
No, these 2 antennas, SKG's old antenna and our Channel 40 antenna, are still up there.
Yeah, but only one of them is broadcast.
Yeah, the one that's on digital, Channel 8.
Right.
The one that's on Channel 8 is the only one that's broadcasting. We have an FM station on the tower. No, we have 2 FM stations on the tower, and they pay rental. You know, it helps because you need money to maintain the towers. For instance, the towers are going to be painted, I think, in the next couple of years. It's going to cost $50,000 to paint that tower.
Wow.
That's the kind of money you're talking about. Then we had to replace the guy wires about 4 or 5 years ago, and that was a $300,000 project also. So you had to have revenue to do it. And the stations didn't pay anything. WICZ didn't pay any rental because they were owned.
Oh, sure.
They were paying it at one time, but not. Then the controllers got involved with the tax rules and decided that the best thing is we won't charge you, but we'll you don't have to take your funds to pay for it, but we're going to have you on the books as being whatever. So that, you know, the tax guys worked that out. I don't know how that worked. But anyway, that's what happened there. So we then are at the stage where, of course, WNBF radio got sold. I think 2 or 3 times.
Right.
And INR has been sold. Clear Channels now owns it. WMRV is now part of Clear Channels.
Yeah.
WKOP is part of Citadel, which WNBF is part of. So there's no local.
Citadel was sold to
Somebody,
Cumulus.
yeah, somebody, yeah. I can't keep up with all the sales. The only locally owned station is WLBT, and it's owned by a man and a guy by the name of Galinsky, Steve Galinsky.
Yeah.
And that's the only locally owned. All the rest of them are owned by other people. Now,
well, I was going to say, you brought some more pictures. Did you want to talk about these other pictures, or was that later in your...
No, we're getting close. Before I do this, we did, when we were on radio back in the 40s and 50s, we did remotes from a church on Front and Main Street, the First Congregational Church. Every Sunday, we took a box with 4 faders, and we hooked up to the telephone. And we did this every Sunday. I did about 2 or 3 broadcasts, but most of the time it was done by another guy. By the way, that was the church Cheryl and I got married in.
Oh.
Not because we did remotes. That was her choosing. So anyway, we did remotes. We also did remotes from the park where the Triple Cities team was down in Johnson City. We did remotes from there.
So they broadcast the games?
Yeah, we broadcast games that were played. We didn't broadcast all of them, but a large majority of them. And the press box was way up on top of the grandstand, and you had to take the remote box and carry it up. And on top of that, we had to carry 2 car batteries in case the power dropped out. We used to hook up to the car battery.
And so you used a remote transmitter, or did you go on a telephone line? How'd you do
go
that?
telephone. This is all on telephone line.
Okay.
You just take a remote box, which was really a small console. That's how we did the baseball games. Now, the away games, that was an interesting way that happened. The away games was the guy that was that did the Triple City. His name was Jack Hand. He sat in the studio, and then somebody at the ballparks, wherever the games were, Reading, and would send with Morse code over a telephone line what was going on, and all you got was we had a Western Union guy who sat there, and when the clacker that was used for the Morse code, he had a tobacco can to amplify the noise, so he'd hear the clacking and he could read the Morse code, and all you got was that the guy hit the ball, went to first base. Okay. Meanwhile, Jack Hand is making this a big deal. Yeah. He's sitting there in front of the mic, and it's Harry is over here, and John's running over this way, and all he's getting is the basic stuff. But that's how we did the away game.
So the announcer had to know Morse code?
No. The guy, that's the Western Union guy, would tell him. The Western Union guy had a typewriter, and he typed the thing and handed him the paper. Okay?
I see.
No, he didn't know the Morse code. He didn't know. No, Jack Hand was he went to work for Associated Press eventually, but he was a great sportcaster.
I guess.
Yeah, he was. And we did those, and we did the away games by Western Union, and we also tried to develop, which you now see if you watch football games, you'll eventually see a guy with a big plastic thing with a mic in it. Well, we tried to do this to get the crack of the bat. Okay? So what we took was an old wash thing.
Like a wash tub?
Metal tub, yeah. Put a microphone in there, and you could get something, but never had the real stuff. So we gave that up. So that's fundamentally what we did in radio, and of course we had live shows. We had a show by a guy by the name of Ralph Carroll. He did a show every noontime, Monday through Friday. He did a talk show. He invites people and they talk about some event or something. He also would talk a lot about he'd take trips. He had what is called a Carroll Caravan. He'd have a bus load of people and they go places, see places. He also went to churches and gave talks with slides and scope, gave them film, and with that he would, that would be the trade-off.
Is it true, Ralph once told me that he was one of the first announcers on WNBF radio.
He probably
Would you
was. That
remember
was
that?
before my time.
He also told me that he was from South Africa.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah. And another thing about him, he lived 4 blocks from Arlington Hotel, come to work on a bicycle. He didn't have a driver's license. Okay?
Oh, he didn't.
He finally got a driver's license, but before he retired or something. But yeah, he was an interesting person, and he had one thing. Every time he had to go to a church to give a talk, since he didn't have a car, he would come to one of us engineers and say, "Would you drive me out? Because you'll get a free dinner at the church. They have a dinner." So yeah, okay,
Sure.
we weren't making that kind of money. We turned down free dinner.
Free meal.
So we would go with him. I went him twice. The other engineer he went most of it. He went with most of it. But anyway, Ralph Carroll did his bit. Then we had a woman on who was sponsored by Fowler, Dick and Walker, the department store, and she was name was Dottie Robinson, and she talked to women about women's problems and things of that nature. Then we had another woman, and I can't remember her name, but she was the cooking one. She gave out recipes and things like that. And then we had another woman who gave all the events that were taking place in the community, sort of a community calendar type thing. And her name was Titchener. Titchener, her husband owned Titchener's Works, which was on Clinton Street, that made steel cables. But she came on and she did this bit. I think she was on the air about twice a week or something. And then, of course, we used to do a thing called the Little White Church of Conklin. Remember that? That was right after sign-on in the morning, do a 15-minute bit with the pastor and all that thing. And then following that, we went into the music and talk with an announcer called Sam Page. His name was Sam Page, and he took over the morning till the Ralph Carroll show. Then somebody else came on. And we also had a sports announcer who did sport. He was an announcer. He did sports at 6 and 11. His name was Bill Pryor. That was his stage name. His real name was Bill Kunkel. I didn't want to use that. So he did the sports. He was the sports guy, other than this Jack Hand who did the games. And so we did that. Then once every month, we brought in a small orchestra in the studio. And they played show tunes and stuff of that era. And there was about 10 people in the band.
Now, this was on television, radio?
No, this is radio.
On NBF radio?
Yeah, still radio. I'm still talking about radio. And so we did that, and we had to set up, a few mics and whatever we did in those days. And we broadcast this orchestra, which was conducted by the guy who was in charge of the music department. In those days, we had a music department with 2 women and this one guy. They picked the songs out to be played on the air. And here's a picture of the library. You can see all the recordings that were there. Believe it or not, most of them were 78s. Before the 33 and the third. And they, various record publishers would send discs around the station to get them played on the air, and the 2 women and this guy, they would pick out the discs, and we had technicians who spun the discs. We didn't have DJs yet.
Right.
because all the announcers ever did was announce. They
Right.
didn't touch equipment or anything.
Now, there was a union at that time?
No,
No.
no union.
Okay, Rick, if you would talk about how commercials were done, recorded early on. I guess many of the commercials started out being live on radio.
Oh, yeah.
And then talk about the development of recordings for commercials.
Well, local commercials, we recorded on these two machines. There were 16-inch discs with a coating just like any phonograph record. That's really what they were. They were really 16-inch phonograph records. And there was two machines there to record them on. And we did a couple of things. We recorded local commercials and we recorded delayed programming. One of the things was Lowell Thomas, who was a talk guy of his day. We recorded him and played him back 15 minutes later for whatever reasons the program people thought. So we recorded stuff on those discs, and then
This recorded, then, it had a needle on it, and it burned in the sound.
It cut the spirals, just like you see on a phonograph record. And you had to be very careful because the shaving that came off had to come out at the right angle, or it would break the needle. Okay, the needle was a quartz device, and it cut the surface. And the national spots came in on discs, 16-inch discs. You'd probably have anywhere from 6 to 10 cuts, and the guy who was going to play them would find the right cut and play it and what have you. So that's how we recorded a lot of commercials during radio time. Just to digress, we tried that on television, but it didn't work out too good because you couldn't synchronize the slides with the thing, and so we did everything live with slides when we did commercials on television. But in radio, we were able to do this. They also used them to audition announcers. They'd bring an announcer in, and we'd cut a thing, and then the manager would listen to it and decide whether he wanted them or not. Because the manager was a voice instructor, and he had one famous line. He said, "I want you to talk from your balls. I don't want you squeaking." Because some of the people we have on today, they squeak. He wouldn't have that. No. Guy had to have a deep bass voice, really. But anyway, that's how we did discs.
And then it evolved into from discs that were 78, and then they went to 33, or
no, we were still on 78 with discs. We then went into tape, paper tape that was on paper with the oxide on the cover. This was a invention that a German company came up with, and we had two machines that played paper tape. Quality wasn't terrific, but it wasn't.
it was like on a reel-to-reel
Yeah,
type
it was
machine.
reel-to-reel, just two reels. And then we even tried recording on what we call a wire recorder. It was a thin yellow wire.
Yeah.
Problem with that, the wire get tangled up in the spool, and
Yeah.
it ended up being a doorstop in one of the control rooms. And then, of course, you went to tape, audio tape, as we now know it today. Still reel-to-reel. It was always reel-to-reel. And that's how we did commercials, but mostly we did commercials on discs. We did that for a long time. They had a problem with the discs, too. During the war, aluminum had to be used for the war effort. So they made the disc out of glass, okay, and put the coating on it. And we used those until we ran out. Then when the war ended, we were able to get aluminum-based disc again, because what happened to the glass disc was one night we recorded Lowell Thomas, the engineers walking into the control room, drops it, smashed into thousands of pieces, and we...
So what did you do? Lowell Thomas's show from yesterday?
No. We went to organ music for 15 minutes. No, we didn't have any show from previous.
Okay.
Now, what I'm going to show you here is the control rooms in the studio. we had three studios, and this is one of them. It was a smaller studio, and that console was made by Western Electric, which was the high fidelity company of its day. We had three of those consoles, one in this, and one in the TV room, the TV studio, and then the one in the radio. This is the radio studio. You can see the chair, you can see the turntable off to one side there, and that's where the technician who spun the discs. This will just give you an idea of all the equipment that was required to do remotes and all sorts of things. We carried race results illegally. How we got them was across the street from the Arlington Hotel was where they had a betting parlor behind a tailor shop. The tailor shop was up front, and one of the engineers just ran a wire across Court Street, had a little remote box, and as soon as the things would come over the wire from the racetracks, he would give the thing. Well, everybody who bet on the games would be listening, because what happened was that you're getting the results after the race was run. So people knew whether they lost their money or they made their money. And we didn't broadcast this. We had it on a speaker in this room here, so the staff could go in there who did the betting. You know. So that's what it took to do that. This is another shot, better shot of the AM control room. You can see all sorts of equipment.
So there was another a studio on the other side of the glass then, huh? Right?
Well, it was a studio here, either side of the glass. You know, it was a studio, glass, and then the console.
Right.
And there were three studios. The one studio that became the TV studio was originally designed to be an FM studio. It had funny walls to make the sound bounce off and all that kind of stuff. Well, it didn't work. So when we went to television, that was the end of the FM studio. We didn't futz around with that anymore. Now here are some of the pictures of the studio. This one here, you can see there's a piano there, which obviously we had people come in and play the piano on the air, on and off. But that was the table there with the microphones where the announcer sat. And also when they did talk shows, we had two microphones, one for the person you were interviewing and one for the announcer. This is another shot of these studios are down in the basement of the Arlington Hotel. And that's another shot showing it. And now, can you imagine us getting in an orchestra in that? We had to take the piano out because the orchestra didn't need a piano. And this is the picture of the talk show table with the two microphones. And you can see the control room off beyond where the clock is.
What do you suppose those microphones are worth today?
Who knows? I don't know, but we went through a whole, in those days, the various RCA came out with a bunch of different microphones, and every time a new one came out, we got it, okay? Those are RCA Ribbon Mics. They were known as Ribbon Mics. Eventually, CBS came out with a mic. The network had some company make their mic, and the mic was designed for a guy who did a daily show on network. I'm trying to get his name now.
Paul Harvey?
No.
Before him.
He had a program called the Talent Scouts. Arthur Godfrey.
Arthur Godfrey. Yeah.
Arthur Godfrey had to have that microphone. That was his. He wanted that one, and that's what he had. Then every station who saw that was on the CBS network got one of those mics. You know. So we went through a whole series of mics on the idea we'd get better fidelity. That was the whole idea. And sometimes it was, and sometimes it wasn't. this gives you an idea of the reception area where there's a big picture of some shot in the Triple Cities. It was sitting there where the receptionist, you can see the gumball machine. And this is another shot of the same. When they would change that background every now and then. That's a shot, aerial shot of the city of Binghamton.
Well, that's the confluence picture,
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, this is just gives you another idea of what the studio looked like. The main studio. That's what the main studio looked like. So that's how we operated in those days. And we operated both AM and FM out of those studios. We had an FM studio. One of the studios was an FM studio. We played classical music. And one of the interesting things about playing classical music, the manager's wife, she was a classical music teacher. She taught classical music. So she'd listen to everything we ever played on FM. She had the radio going, And one day we had a guy who was not musically inclined to spin the records, okay? And the people that picked the records would always put on a script how long the record was going to run. So I'm doing some work in the studio, and this guy calls me over and says, I got to play, he had 4 discs to play. And he said, this is going to take more time than what they've got on there. He said, they've got 30 minutes and 10 seconds. I'm only halfway through this thing, and it's never going to do it. It's going to take an hour to do this. So I said, what the hell, how can that be? So I look on the turntable, and he's playing 78s at 33 1/3. Okay? And the phone rings. And who's on the other end of the phone? Mrs. Maston. What's going on? So I said to her, well, we have a little bit of trouble with the equipment. I didn't want to get the guy in trouble.
The turntable was going.
I said it'll be taken care of in the next few minutes. So that was, this guy, he was embarrassed because he didn't, the music sounded like it was supposed to be as far as he was concerned. But I could hear it because I was going to be a trained musician myself. So
I didn't know that.
Oh yes, I was a violinist.
Oh.
Yeah, in my young days, I was a concert master at my high school orchestra.
Oh,
but I gave it up when I went into electronics. And I have a violin, I had it redone. I'm trying to see if I can remember how to play it yet. I tried it a couple of times, and it's disaster. Total disaster. But yeah, I got interested in classical music while I was going to the school in Philadelphia. I went to where the Philadelphia Orchestra used to play.
Oh.
Ormandy was the conductor's name.
Yeah.
And I got there and I got to like classical music. And in fact, I have a lot of discs. I just bought a new turntable to play some of these 33 1/3 discs.
Yeah.
When I'm reading the newspaper and not doing anything that takes mental requirements, I play the music. Because I love music. I mean, I will watch anything. In fact, I gave you Tony Bennett discs. Tony Bennett was on the other year on SKG a couple of nights ago. And he sang with various people like, I don't remember all their names.
Lots of singers.
Yeah, so he had duets with these people.
You mentioned some of the management people.
Yeah.
You mentioned Mayor Kramer.
Yeah.
Did you work for him?
No.
No. Yeah, and you mentioned Cecil Maston.
Yeah.
And George Dunham. And what about some of the other people that you worked for?
On the television side, I went through 6 managers.
6?
Yeah. First guy, his name was Taylor. The Gannett Company sold the station in Elmira, the radio station. But being a that type of company, they moved a lot of the personnel who didn't want to work for the new people to Binghamton when we had openings in radio. And so his name was Taylor, and they made him a television manager. And he didn't know a nickel's worth a dime out of what television's all about. And he kept asking me, and then he'd ask my wife, who was then she was the copywriter, she was the program director, she was in charge of the news guys, she did the whole smear. And her boss, the Gannett Company, brings a guy in from Danville where they had another station. A guy was worked there as an announcer or something. He was a stage manager in Broadway. That was his background. So he was supposed to be the guy in charge. We're going to sign on. Came to sign on. Okay. He gets stage fright and stays home.
No.
He can't take it. My wife kept telling me he's having trouble. I don't know what it is, but so he doesn't show up. So the manager comes running into me and saying, "What are we going to do?" I said, "Go get my wife, and you talk to her, and you tell her that you want her to do the deal." So she did. She signed on WINR TV, which is now ICZ. She got the traffic system going. She had the commercials, which were pre-written. You always wrote commercials 2 or 3 days in advance. And she had 2 other women helping her do this. And so she got the thing on the air, got the announcers scheduled and all that, and she was there till, I don't know, 8, 9 o'clock that day. I was there with her because
No, that was when ICZ first went on the air?
Yeah, that was on. The AM studio was above a drugstore down on Hawley Street and, where the Bingham Savings Bank had a big building.
Yeah.
And it was a drugstore.
Right. It was a family name, as I recall.
Yeah, and it was a drugstore, and on top was the radio studio. Oh. And since we weren't in television, that's not when we were in television yet. And it caught fire one night. We had a fire in the studio.
Oh.
Caused by the fire in the drugstore. And so we moved from that location where we went to television to where we were on Henry Street, which is above the tire store, the Goodyear Tire, which is still there. And they built the second story over that building. That's what they did. And that's where we set up the television operation. But that first day that we were going to go on the air, that was, it was chaos. The manager, he figured people in Rochester who were the main, the Gannett people in Rochester would come down on him.
You don't remember his name, do you?
Yeah, Taylor. His name was Taylor.
What was the first name?
I can't remember his first name, but Dale Taylor.
Dale Taylor.
Yeah. And he'd come to me when we were buying equipment, and he'd keep asking me, "How much is this going to cost?" I said, "What are you worried about? There's a budget, and I'm going to stay in the budget, and we're going to get on the air. Let's not get excited." But he used to worry. So finally, they sent him back to a station in Rochester, which they owned, WHEC. Yeah. Was in Rochester, and he became a salesman of some sort. He wasn't a manager anymore. And then they hired, the press hired, trying to think of the next guy. I can't remember the next guy's name. I can visualize these people, but can't remember their name. But anyway, eventually they hired Ed Scala. Ed Scala became a manager of ICZ.
Now, Ed had been program director at
NBF.
NBF.
And my wife was his assistant.
Oh.
Okay, when they were still working at NBF. And he was a manager at a station in Altoona that Triangle owned.
Oh, Ed Scala was?
Yeah, he was a manager there.
Oh, we did.
And then he got transferred to Binghamton, and he was a sales manager then.
Huh.
And then he he left WNBF and worked for WICZ, and he was there for about, I don't know, 5-6 years. And he got fired. The president came in one day, because the station was losing money, tons of money.
Right.
We were losing something like $200,000 a month.
Month?
Oh yeah, we were losing the salary. People were still there. You still had to pay salaries.
Yeah.
And so they bring in a guy from Philadelphia. The head guy of Triangle's name was Roger Clipp. And he was an SOB of the first quarter. My wife had to work with him, and she used to tell me so. She'd go down to Philadelphia to the staff meetings, and he'd just say, "I want this done, and I want it done today, not tomorrow." You know, one of those guys, you know. So he brings in a guy who was a salesman. The salesman worked for the station in Philadelphia. Before that, he sold storm windows. You can see what the background experience that these people had. So he comes on, and he's an alcoholic. He doesn't show up half of the time at the station.
That wasn't Court Dawson, was it?
Yeah.
It wasn't Court Dawson.
You know the name. He rented a place out in one of the lakes.
Oh, okay.
And he didn't show up half the time. Okay. So after about 6 months of him, you know, that's when, he was the guy that replaced the Taylor guy.
Oh.
Then Ed Scala came on, okay? Then after Ed Scala, they hired a guy by the name of Jesse Pevere. Jesse Pevere came from a station in Wilkes-Barre. He got found by the president of the company who used to go to NAB, and I'd go there because he insisted that I go with him, because I'd take him around and watch the exhibits and all that kind of stuff. And so they bring in this Jesse Pevere, and he gets the station to make money. We made money finally. Up until that time, the station lost tons and tons of money. And he came on board, and he was there until the daughter of the president, her name was Nora Gazewitz. She eventually got married to this guy who was from a rep company in New York, sold national sales stuff. And he was supposed to be the expert, and she worked at NBC's bookstore. That's her background. Okay, so the president who did everything for his kids.
Right.
I mean, you know, he had a son and 2 other daughters. He had 3 daughters and a son. And this one daughter, he thought she could manage the station. Okay, and finally they let Jesse Pevere go, which was the first mistake in there. And they, not only at that time, we had the NBC network, and this woman and her husband went to the Fox network because the Fox network gave them $250,000 if they joined the Fox network. Well, you know, that's peanuts to the budget, but they bid on it, and they lost the NBC network, which was stupid because the NBC network was the #1 network at the time. So she became the manager. Then after she was there a while and she wasn't doing too good, and the stockholders at Stainless were getting a little chancy about losing this money and not getting any dividends. And they vote her out. The board of directors down there vote the daughter out, and they bring on this other woman whose name was Alice Reel. She's in real estate right now. She works for some real estate company. She came from a station in Atlanta. She was a salesperson. She came in, and the station started to go ash can again. And finally, they got rid of her about the time that the new company, Northwest Broadcasting, which now owns the station, bought the station, and that's when John Leete was hired. Come on, John Leete worked at WIVT. He was the manager up there. He left there for I don't know what the reasons were, but I'm sure he had good reasons. And he came to work for us, and he's still there. And he's kept the station above seawater.
Well, John was at Channel 40 before he went
Yeah, he
over.
was a
to-
salesman when we were over at ICZ,
Right.
when we were over at above the Goodyear store. Yeah, he also worked at WNBF, I think, radio for a while
Oh,
too.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think he worked at WNBF radio also, and
Okay.
so he came on board, and he's the
Let me ask you. Now, you've seen radio go from and television go from the very, very beginning when I think you told Bill Parker that you had three, you had camera 1 and camera 3, but you didn't have a camera 2, and you've gone from there to being on television, television being on for like 4 hours, and radio and all this development, and now radio is into the digital age and all. What do you see? You've seen all these changes over this period of time. What do you see now for the future of radio and television?
Well, radio, the only thing radio's got on the horizon is digital radio, which is supposed to be a higher fidelity. I don't know if any of the stations are doing this yet, but that's the next step as far as radio is concerned. As far as television is concerned, the next step is mobile television. We're going to put out from our transmitters to iPods and all that stuff, either programs or information, and that's supposedly going to bring in some revenue. That's what television stations are looking for. That seems to be the next step, because we...
So what will happen then is this isn't coming over, this isn't coming out on the cell phone, this is coming out of the air
Yeah,
to a cell phone then,
Yeah,
or,
or a cell
whatever,
phone or iPad
the books
or
are the,
whatever.
right, yeah.
they're going to be... the three companies already came out with some prototypes of these things. They're not necessarily tied into as it uses a telephone. They're mainly used to get this TV stuff. And the idea with it is you might put some programs on it, but who's going to, walk down the street and see a program?
Or drive.
Drive, yeah, that's going to be the other problem. The thing is to get information, weather, sports, scores, things of that nature, information, basically. That's what the theory is. Now, whether this is going to work, we have 6 stations in our group, and the station in Spokane is going to be the first station to go into this and see what it really means. I think it's got a place, but I don't think it's the end all of the technology. But the next step that's going to happen is, right now we have a system in digital called a MPG2, and we're now going to upgrade to a source called a PG4. What this is going to allow to put more signals on the bandwidth. In other words, whether it be television or satellite, you can get more channels, okay, and still have high fidelity pictures and sound, because this is the next step that the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers have a group of people who work on these things year-round, and they're coming up with this new system that's going to allow for more channels. For instance, a satellite now has 150 channels. Could have 300 with this system. Now, the question always is, what the hell are you going to do with all these channels?
Right. Who's going to pay for it?
Well, that's right. And who's going to use it? I mean, even today with the 150 channels or whatever you can get on cable or something or other, actually people are only utilizing about 10 of those. The average is 10. 24. So what's going to happen to the extra bandwidth? I think what it'll do is it'll allow for be able to do things between points of interest. In other words, you want to send something from here to another building or another state, and you want to do it via satellite, and you can do it two-way, which we already have some of that now. We have two-way conversation. Instead of sending a group of people to a conference, you have the conference and the people stay where they are, and you save on travel money, okay? And they can
But you think it's going to go through satellite soon?
well, go through satellite or go on cable. It'll also go off over the air. If we can put, right now, we can put you can put more than that. If we don't carry any HD during the day, which a lot of stations are doing, you can put 5 channels on. You can have 5 different programs you can feed to people, okay?
So,
but it's not HD. It's just normal.
The stereo.
Yeah, stereo, normal pictures.
Yeah.
You know, the quality is better than analog, but it's not high def.
Oh, so you're talking television and radio then?
Well, no, I don't know about radio, but television you could, and as far as radio is concerned, this system doesn't work for radio. Radio's a different.
So then, locally we have now, 1, 2, 3, we have 4 stations now, but it's going to be possible for each of those transmitters to send out, different programs on that same
channel. Yeah, right now we have stations with 2 channels. WNBF has 2 channels. WIVT has 2 channels. ICZ has 2 channels. SKG has 3 channels. Now, if you can take that same bandwidth and put more channels on, now the theory behind this, and it's being discussed many ways, and of course I'm going to give you my opinion. My opinion is free television is what we need. We don't need to have people going out spending $120 a month or whatever they pay for it, when they can get, right now, with the 2 channels, let's see, we got 3 channels, that's 6 and 3. We have 9 channels really off the air. Don't cost you a damn nickel.
But you need an antenna to do that, right?
Sure, but you can buy an antenna for a few bucks. If you're in the metro area, all you need is a rabbit ears or whatever they sell these days. I got them at my house. I watch digital off the air because I have to keep checking that things are working right, and I have no problem picking it up. So you have these channels available, but the problem that I see is the broadcaster is not taking advantage of this. They're not promoting it. To go out there and say that they did for a little while. NAB ran some stuff and then it died, because what the commission is going to do, they're going to take some more of the frequencies away from television. They're in the process. It's been going on for about 5-6 years now. And the broadcasts are fighting it tooth and nail, except they'll accept certain portions of it. What they want to do is they're called repackaging, because they already took away channels. Right now you go to channel 2 to 51. Originally you went from channel 2 to 81. And they've taken away all those and given it to telephone companies, satellite people, or whatever. And these people are saying they need more frequencies because the public is going to expand into this technology like it wasn't going to stop. But what the problem is, they already have these frequencies, but they're not using them. And they're asking for more, and they're not even using what they got. And they paid, millions of dollars for it. They had to buy it from the federal government. And so they're talking about squeezing the stations together. And now that brings up a multitude of technical problems, interference problems particularly. And I'm sure that engineering can solve the problem, but it's going to take money for stations to have to do this, and stations are not having the greatest time of their life in the economy, and this is not the time, I think, to try to do this kind of thing. So hopefully it'll take some more time. But if you can get 7 stations and then you go to this new system and you can get 14 stations, I mean, how much more entertainment do you need in your home? I mean, that's what I keep saying to myself. you know, a guy's got 150 channels, he only looks at 10 of them. So one of the things that I have tried to get, and I talk to Time Warner now and then, is how about a la carte? Like, why can't somebody buy the channels they want and not pay for all the channels that other people are using, which I'm not getting any benefit from? And their argument is, when you do that, the cost will increase because the programming costs will go, you know. And I say to myself, well, give me the example. Well, they can't come up with it. Well, they can come up with the rhetoric. It's going to cost more. And I said, you know, I don't see how it's going to cost more. You're going to have less revenue, but you're losing subscribers anyway. I mean, you're losing them to satellite, and you're losing them to free television. Free television, as of before we went digital, was about 15% of the country was still off the air. Now it's up to 28%. Because people, the economy being what they have to cut something out, so they cut out going on satellites, they cut out going on cable, because they can get it off the air, and they can get 7 channels, or in the communities that have you during the weekdays before you hit prime time, you got 5 channels plus the 2 other channels. You got 7 channels coming out of one station. You multiply that, you go to a station like, go to a place like Chicago and New York.
Right.
My God, you're going to have so many things that you can't see. But the broadcasters have a thing that they think that's not going to work. And I say to them, well, you may be right. I don't know if it's going to work, but at least try. You know, give it a shot. You're all sitting here telling me you can't get the revenue because I go in and we talk about engineering budgets and you know, last year was here, this year it's here, next year it's going to be down here. Because,
well, look at, speaking of costs, how do you suppose the number of employees at, say, NBF, AM, FM, TV, how do you suppose that today compares from the 50s to today, the number of people that are working there?
well, I think the number of people that are working there a lot more than they were back in the 50s and 60s, because first of all, we weren't on the air that long. Secondly, a lot of us didn't have news departments, which eats up a considerable amount of people. I don't think the technology is going to affect the people. I mean, it's not one of those things where if I go to this new system, broadband system, that I'm going to lay off people, because you're going to need more, because you're going to put on more programming. You're going to insert more commercials. You're going to have more artwork to do. You know, it may raise the amount of people working at these stations, but at the present time, being the economy the way it is, nobody's ready to make this jump yet. I mean, this is one of those things that you have to wait until things settle down in the economy, and but I don't think technology. I can, for instance, back in the 1950s, we had a job called projectionist.
Mm-hmm.
He's the guy that loaded up the film on the projector. Mm-hmm. That job is no longer required, because now we got discs and tape, and we syndicate the shows and then we play them. You know, so we don't have a guy, because in those days, when you got a program on film, you had to insert the commercials, spliced them in, spliced them out when you were done, because it went to the next station. So you needed a guy doing that. So that job disappeared. Right. So if you say to yourself, well, that means there's one less, technology took over. Well, it took over one job.
Well, and you also had shipping and receiving.
Oh, yeah.
For all the syndicated shows that had to be mailed out. And,
yeah, but the shipping and receiving was done by the same people. You know.
Oh, they did the slicing.
They did it. You know, it was one of those things. You know, who goes out to the door to sign for it? You know?
Yeah.
It wasn't that big a deal.
Yeah.
But the technology eliminated that particular job. Now, some of the cameraman jobs have disappeared, because now you got robotic cameras that'll do all the things from a guy. And all right, so what you've done is, if you had 2 cameramen, now you got one guy doing 2 cameras. I mean, so you can say to yourself, well, the technology has caused that problem. But there are other things that the technology requires more engineering staffs to keep up with all this stuff.
Oh, really?
Oh, sure.
Oh, here,
Good stuff.
I don't know why, but I thought that stations, especially radio stations, cut down on their
Radio
engineering staff.
stations can do this, but television stations, they try to do this, but they pay for it in the long run because of the stuff. Either if they shoot a commercial and the client takes a look at it and says, "What the hell is that?" You know. So I think that technology, it'll affect certain jobs, but then for every job that it affects, it creates another one, because it's a new technology and it needs a different approach.
Yeah.
So you still need copywriters.
Yeah.
We can't, we haven't got a robotic guy writing copy. We need people who can photograph. They still have to photograph. And even though you may have a robotic cameras, I think ICZ's got that. They got a system. They've had it for years.
Oh, robotic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, the robotic cameras again requires maintenance. I mean, they work sometimes, and sometimes they're not going to work because they're that kind of a situation. So you lose a job here and you pick one over here, and you sort of evens it out. So I don't think the technology is the thing to answer. The question boils down to, can the stations create enough revenue to keep going? I mean, this is where the big problem is. We may see stations go off the air.
Well, I was going to ask you that. I know that in my hometown, it's a real small town. They took their AM off the air. There's still an FM there, but the FM is pretty much just picking up satellite programming. Do you see that in the future? The AM's going silent?
No, AM has found its niche, talk radio.
Mm-hmm.
That's what AM is. It's talk radio mostly now. It's found its niche, and they get an audience. People love to hear other people's problems, all that kind of stuff. So that AM has, done its bit. Now, I can't tell you what 20 years from now whether AM will be around or not. I don't know. I won't be here to see it whether it is or not. But the question is, radio and television is fighting the battle of the economy. That's what it's fighting. And you need people in management and sales and in programming that know this is happening and make the necessary adjustments. Not just sit there and say, "Holy hell, this thing's ash can is going in we're not going to get anywhere." So the management people in particular, and since I worked with a lot of management people in my day, I found that managers are always behind the times. They're never here, okay? Because they're always worrying about today, not worrying about tomorrow. First thing they worry about when they come through the door, how many sales did we make? That's the first thing you hear in the morning. But they don't project like we used to do it. When Stainless owned the station, we projected budgets for 5 years. We didn't just project a budget for each year, which is what they do now. Mm-hmm. They come up each year and they go through the motions of whatever they go through. But if you have a plan, even though you have to change it, we did. We had a 5-year plan for engineering, for production, for news, sales, and if something changed in the economy, we'd make changes. We would just sit there and say it was etched in stone. But at least every member of the staff had some idea where we were going. Not sitting there saying to themselves, "I wonder what's going to happen tomorrow. I wonder what's going to happen in the next 2 hours." That's very disruptive, I think, to a staff who is made up mostly of artists, engineers, writers. These people are talented people. They're not just something you go out and take a shovel and shovel some dirt. These people are talented people, and they have feelings, and you have to take those in consideration. Because one of the things I talked to him yesterday, he thinks I was talking into joining a union. What I talked about yesterday was WICZ has been a unionized station. You were a member of it.
Oh, yeah, 30 years ago.
For ever since it went on the air. When it was radio, television, And I negotiated quite a few contracts in my day when I was asked to do it. Sometimes the managers mostly did it, but sometimes managers, for some reason or other, didn't want to get into the nitty-gritty that has to be done. And so people often say to me, well, if you had a union, you couldn't do anything. You had no flexibility. I said, no, we never gave away the flexibility. We made it increase their wages. We might have, we came up with time and a half when you worked a holiday. We came up with health insurance. We came up with vacations. If you're there for 20 years, you had 3 weeks vacation. I don't know what the rule is now. I got 3 weeks vacation. I never ever took them all. But, you know, I had.
I remember the one big thing with the union was that the employees knew 10 days from now when they were working.
Yeah.
Without the union,
Yeah.
it would be, you wouldn't know when you were working tomorrow.
Yeah.
So that was a big help.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things. Since I had good rapport with it. I used to go out and have drinks with the negotiator. You know, I got to know him. You know, and we discussed various problems and what management wanted and what the people wanted, and we managed to work. We only heard the word strike once. I only heard that once in the negotiation. That's because this one guy was off his rocker. He just didn't like anything that management did. Management was no good. I pointed at him one day, what about your job? What if management gave you a job, didn't it, you know? So it didn't happen. Now, a lot of people, like Will said to me the other day, he likes the right to work law. So that's fine if you like the right to, because you have to pay dues. But what I didn't tell him yesterday, the dues are tax deductible. The dues are tax deductible. What are we talking about? You know, okay?
That's true.
And but as you pointed out, we had the contract had the rules. You knew what was going to happen.
Yep.
You planned your life around it.
Yep.
You didn't worry that someday some managers are going to come in and say, "You're all going to work 8 hours, and I'm not going to pay you."
Right.
And there are managers who would do this.
Sure. Well, that was, as I recall, that was one of the major advantages was that on Friday you knew what your schedule was until a week from Monday, and that was a big thing. Rick, I think we've talked quite a while here, and as you were talking, I was doing some math in my head. And I was saying, you started in learning this stuff about 1940, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
And that was 70. That was 70 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you mind my asking how old you are?
No, I'm 89.
How many?
89.
89. Okay.
I'm going to have my 90th. He's going to give me a birthday
Okay.
party.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope I get invited.
And my wife was 91 when she passed away.
Oh wow.
Last July.
Yeah.
So we both went into the 90s.
Yeah. Well, actually, in your lifetime, broadcasting, commercial broadcasting, has been with you in your whole life.
Oh yeah.
When it started, KDKA was 1927, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Well, that's when radio went on. But I came into this whole electronics thing just before I got into the Army. The Army trained me, and then because I took corresponding courses when I was at the transmitter, being a transmitter operator, taking readings every half an hour. I had plenty of time to do a course.
Really?
And I took a course which the GI Bill paid for. You know, that's one of the. In fact, the job I got at Schenectady, I went in for the interview, and as we went through the interview, the guy said, "Are you a discharged from the Army?" I said, "Yes." "You're hired."
Wow.
So I said, "You hired me because you're trying to be patriotic?" "Well," he says, "in a way, but the government pays for half your salary.
A business decision. All right. Well, Rick, I want to thank you very much. And to me, this has been just really, really interesting, and learning about all of these developments over the years. And I guess we should say that you're still working.
Yeah.
You've been with Channel 40 now for what's that, 50 years?
Well, I was there for 34 years as a chief engineer, and I've been a consultant for I was a consultant for the whole 6 stations for about 10 years, and then I decided I didn't want to deal with 6 stations, so I'm consulting now for ICZ.
Yeah.
And what the consulting boils down to is mostly transmitter problems. They have transmitter problems. They pick up the phone and I do the thing. But I originally put all the 6 stations on digital. That was my job when I was working with the 6 stations. We had a station in Spokane, a station in Medford, Oregon, a station in Pendleton, Oregon, a station in Corpus Christi, Texas, and one in, Lebanon, down by the Rio Grande. And I got all those stations on the air digitally. And I did it all from my home. I never went out to visit the stations. I got photographs. I had guys send me photographs because I'm not a great traveler. But I did it all from my home.
Oh.
And my wife often said to me, "How can you do this all from your home without going out visiting?" It's done. Don't worry about it. I'm doing it. Don't worry about it. So that's the story. Well, I hope everybody will enjoy my talk. I've loved this business, and I've been in it really for 65 years. The rest of the time was in my service time, and I'm still looking forward to working in it as long as somebody will hire me.
There you go. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rick. I appreciate